Hello everyone and welcome for another Apitherapy video. This time we'll talk about a huge question that I get all the time while I'm promoting bee products for health. It's something that many people have in mind, and the courageous ones will actually ask the question. Here's the question: is it legitimate to harvest bee products from a beehive? Aren't we just stealing a beehive? Is there something bigger behind this? Yes, there is two points of views on this. So, first one, to answer directly to the question, would be yes, it is legitimate in some circumstances. And the second point of view is, well, it's not a point of view, but in other circumstances, the answer would be no. So it's not a direct yes all the time, and it's not a total no. If you want to be really ethical about it, there's really two cases. So the first one, the famous yes, it is legitimate, is in accordance with the respect that the beekeeper has with the bees. Just hearing the word beekeeper, we see that we're keeping bees, we're making sure the bees are healthy. We're kind of guardians of the bees, huh? Beekeepers, it's like a guardian of the bees. So when you're guarding, when you're keeping bees, you're actually making sure that they live in a really healthy way. You want to make sure they're not in presence of pesticides. You want to make sure that if you are in a cold climate, you will insulate them sufficiently so that they live well and they're not cold and they don't die. You're going to make sure if there's a disease that you'll find the best, softer treatment possible. Of course, organic, but also soft. The best treatment that exists that does not leave any residue in the beehive, that keeps the beehive clean. You'll find that best method of treatment for your bees. It also implies that you will keep your bees in a place where there's abundance of food for them. And that includes nectar for them to make honey, pollen for them to make their bee bread, propolis for them to get some propolis, well, resin from the bees actually, from the trees, resin from trees to make their propolis and make sure this immune system of the beehive stays strong. They need water and they need all different things. So you'll make sure they live in an abundance of all those things. And what else? Also, for example, for the propolis question, you'll make sure that you have a line of bees that harvest lots of propolis, because there's some selection that happened a lot in North America, but also in Europe as well, I know. Lots of selection of bees producing less propolis. Well, this might be very practical because the beehive then has less propolis and it's easier to move the frames around and so on. So there's a practical side of this, but there's a really bad side of this because bees need propolis for their own immune system of the beehive. And there's a lot of talks about this, so it's obvious, it's crazy that people did that. So you will want lines of propolis that do harvest quite a bit of propolis. So you want to make sure of that as well, that you're not selecting to have bees that have per default a very weak immune system. So that's very important as well. So there's all those things, plus also in some areas in the world where there's cold climates, for example, here in Quebec, people say you have to harvest the entire honey production of your bees and replace it, feed them after with sugar syrup. Well, this practice, some people just, and most people actually, many people do that, and many people will say you have to do it, otherwise your bees will have a hard time digesting the honey in the winter time, and they will die because they won't be able to digest it. So it's a very serious issue. If you're not able to let your bees have their honey during winter because they'll be sick and they'll die, then of course as a beekeeper, you want to make sure they don't die. That's the first goal. So then, of course, you'll feed them with sugar syrup. But you have to know that there are beekeepers in Quebec that are actually letting only the honey of their bees to their bees for winter. And it does work, but you have to know how to do it. You have to do it right. It does exist. So I know beekeepers like this. I do it myself. I have less experience than others. I would trust more other beekeepers than myself for this because they have more beehives than I do, and they do it since a long time. So it does work. There might be a few things you have to adapt, but it does work. So that's another thing you want to consider as well if you want to be really highly ethical. Letting the bees have their own honey is important. So in order not, if you are doing all those things, plus a few other things I don't think about right now, if you do all those things, you will put your bees in such good conditions that they'll be producing a lot of honey. They'll be harvesting also a lot of pollen, and there'll be plenty of propolis in their beehive. So if you do all this, you're giving a lot of energy to your bees. You're really helping them out. And seriously, you do nothing wrong to them. You don't kill them. You're really helping them out. So it's a real win-win situation. You help them. They live in abundance. They can harvest a lot more because they live in a place of abundance. If you want to make sure they live in a place of abundance, one thing to do, for example, is to have bee yards with not too many beehives. Here in Quebec, for example, a bee yard, if you want to respect that abundance principle, should have, anywhere between one, because there can be very few, but usually there's more than one because it takes time to go from place to place. So usually it would be between like 3 or 4 to 8 beehives per bee yard. It gives you an idea. That's for here, but it depends. It's different everywhere in the world because of the vegetation, because their food source is the plants. So you have to look at your plants, at your own situation, and gauge how many beehive am I allowed to put here while keeping those beehives in a situation of food abundance. If there is real food abundance for nectar, pollen, and propolis also, if there is, then you can harvest all three. If there's abundance only of nectar, but there's little pollen, maybe you cannot harvest pollen. But if you have abundance of pollen, but not of nectar, it's the opposite. You can harvest pollen only. And I heard from beekeepers that you cannot harvest pollen because the bees need it, the baby bees, the larvae need that bee bread that the bees make with the pollen to grow. But honestly, for me, I keep very few hives at one place, usually about 3 or 4. And with the vegetation I got here, I'm telling you, I've put my pollen trap year round, and they have tons of pollen in the hive because they can still bring in some pollen from little holes, in those pollen traps most of the time. Now you have to know your pollen trap. You have to monitor your thing. But for me here, I can harvest it zero problem, and I love doing that because it helps me to track on what plants they're going. So I love doing this, and I can do this, and they still have tons of pollen in the hive. Like seriously, like it's packed with it. So there's really a lot. So it's not a problem if you put them in a situation of abundance, and that makes a lot of sense because if they are in nature somewhere, and their vegetation abundance is so and so, well, they'll have sometimes to fly much more to get their food, and this is hard on them. It's a lot of work if they have to, go far away to get their food. If there's a rarity of food, well, if the food is scarce, it will demand them a lot of energy. So if the food is close by and there's a lot, they'll gather so much, and it won't be that hard for them to gather more. So you really are creating a situation where you can have your share, and this is totally ethical. So this is, let's say, the bright side of things, and it's a side of things where you bring your bees where there's no pesticides, there's a variety of food source. so you put them in really good conditions, then of course you're allowed to take your share, and it's totally normal, and actually you're helping your bees to grow. In Canada here, there wouldn't be any honeybees without beekeepers because it's too cold. They wouldn't live here. So we can allow them to grow, to expand, to live here in a place where if we take care of them, they can do wonderful in Canada. So we really help them out, and there's this win-win situation happening. Now, if we look at the other circumstances where the answer would be no, you cannot ethically harvest bee products from a beehive. Well, believe it or not, but this is most of the beehive in the world. From most of the beehive in the world, the answer would be no. If you're really ethical, like if you really think through this, you'll find that it's not a real win-win situation. There's something, we're pushing the bees, we're really exploiting them somehow. And you have to put in that category those pollination things, those big monoculture fields where you bring your bees and you do huge pollination operation, and then your bees, you bring them back in a place where, because when you do a huge pollination need, and I'll give you a couple examples just to be more precise. Let's start with, for example, the almonds in the States and USA. Well, more than 50% of the bees of the whole country are used to pollinate those almond fields. So when that happens, bees are getting all mixed up, and the diseases are spreading all over the place, and it's terrible. And just this principle is harsh on them. But there's more to it. Bees sometimes don't get enough food on the plants they're pollinating. The best example for that one would be the cranberry fields in Canada and the East Coast. There's a lot of cranberries. So if you bring bees there, you almost have to let them starve so that they'll go on the cranberry plants. And because there's very little food and it's not rich food for them there, so they go there, but they don't live in a good situation. You have to help them out, but you cannot feed them too much, because otherwise they will never go on those cranberry plants, because there's not much food for them there, so it's not sufficient. So you're creating some kind of starvation in your beehive while you do this, and it can be more or less extreme, but cranberries are really known to do this. So sometimes I hear from vegan people, for example, and that's a message for vegan people. You don't want to, hurt the animals. So you think, I cannot, take any bee products from a beehive. And you think this, and you're sure of your point, because you think any beekeeper will damage the bees. And you manage to, stick to one or two ideas, and you kind of have that in your mind. And you don't want to take honey ever, nor pollen, nor even propolis for your own health. And this is crazy, but that's the case sometimes. And so you think this way. So think a bit further. If you think this way, think also about all those big pollination things happening. For example, cranberries. Someone that loves cranberries and is, for example, a vegan. This is total nonsense, because if you encourage cranberries, you're actually encouraging starvation of the bees. So a really bad behavior of people against animals, against the bees. So you have to think about also what you're eating as a plant source, So that's for cranberries, but blueberry also is quite questionable. Not as bad as cranberries, of course, but you have to know those things. You have to know a little bit more about what are the bees really doing. People are saying, if bees disappear from planet Earth, then human being will also disappear 4 years after, because there will be a lack of food. It's important to understand that this idea is very scary. When something is scary, we have to think twice about it, because very often people that use fear are not really nice, because we're not made to be scared. So if you're scared of something, scared of I don't know what, the end of the world, like the bees disappear and it's the end of the world, let's say, people that put that kind of idea in your brain, in your mind, are usually they have a weird intent. The intention is not that clear very often. Think about this twice. So for that example, people saying, "Oh, bees will disappear. It's terrible. We have to encourage bees and so on." Very often, where honeybees are pollinating are in huge monoculture crops that very often have pesticides, and very often bees don't have all the food they need there, and very often it creates really weird behavior, that kind of pollination. For example, they bring the bees to pollinate here in Quebec, they bring the bees to pollinate cranberry fields and blueberry fields in the east coast, and when they come back, because they don't have food all year round over there, only when it's not real food, let's say it's not enough food, let's say, over there, because it's not diverse enough, and the richness of the food, especially for cranberries, is quite questionable, more than questionable actually. So they go there and they pollinate, and when they bring those bees back in Quebec, for example, now there's tons of bees that have been starving. There's too many bees for the area where they put them in, and now bees again are competing for food. So that whole principle of that pollination idea of the bees is really questionable. Seriously. So think about that twice. If you are looking at small orchard, it's a different topic. It's not that big very often, and it's okay for many orchards. Not all of them. Remember, the almonds in the States, it's kind of an orchard, it's almonds, but it's not sane at all. It's not good. In that type of cases, I would personally say, no, I don't want bee products from those hives. It's not ethical to take honey from them and so on. Because yes, you're kind of stealing from them. If they have tons of honey, maybe you're not stealing the honey, but you're stealing, you kind of use them as slaves. And really, sometimes that's the feeling you get from the bees in the cranberry fields. Honestly, when you hear and see how the bees look when they come out of there, it's literally like, animal slaves that we use for pollination. So that whole thing about being scared on, if the bees disappear and if the honeybee disappear, then we will be starving to death because there's no food anymore. Think about it a little bit further. The numbers that are given up there are really pinpointing huge monoculture fields. And this type of farming, let's say, agro development, is quite questionable. So if you're really worried about how ethical it is to do this or this or that, you have to think the whole system together. If you think about the first category I was mentioning, where yes, you can actually, you have your share from that type of beekeeping, you really do. You can really have your share of honey and pollen and propolis. It's a totally different story. And you actually have to think that those bee products are really apitherapy bee products, because you took good care of your bees. The quality of the products is awesome because there's no pesticides. There was, very often you have the best quality when you do that type of beekeeping. So those products will have tons of really good properties, will have tons of different uses, and you cherish those products. So your pollen, you won't dehydrate it. You'll keep it fresh frozen, so you keep all the good properties in that pollen because you value it, because you worked for it. It's not a byproduct of your pollination contract. You really worked for those bee products. So there are many different ways of doing beekeeping, and if yes or not it's legitimate to get your bee products from your beehive, it depends on the beekeeping principle that you're using. And that is the answer. If you do it well, you just heard it, it's totally fine. And I'm sure even all the vegans of the world will be fine with this. Because if you do good beekeeping, you're participating in a very sane, very healthy way of doing farming, agro development. So this is actually, you're really playing a good role in that whole situation. But if you do that other way of doing beekeeping where you do huge pollination, there's pesticides all over the place, and it's you have to give supplements to your bees because they don't have enough food, and they have anyway, it's a really bad way to do this. Well, then I would say no, it's not a proper, you shouldn't take bee products from those beehives. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of that whole situation. Now I'd like to add a little point of view on all this. You kind of find out that there's two ways of looking at beekeeping. One way is we think about that, that fear of, honeybees are pollinating our crops, and if they disappear, we will die and all this. Of course, you could use that argument to work against pesticides and reduce pesticides, and that would be a good usage of that fear. But that being said, you don't have to use the fear to do this. If you use that other point of view, the one of apitherapy, where bee products have really high nutritional value, that's for bee pollen, and they can really help our health situation, with the with the propolis, you can answer so many needs for health. It's such a good product. If you look at this direction, then also you can say, with the bees, we need to be pesticide free because we need those products because they are the best to feed ourselves with, and we're the best also to treat ourselves for our health, against bacteria, viruses, funguses, all those things, microbes and so on. They have the best products to do this. So if we look at it this way, you don't have to use the fear of, if the bees disappear, we won't have our food. This is more connected with the big monoculture fields thing, that fear. I don't like it too much. But we should actually fight against pesticides because bee products, apitherapy, is so precious. It has to be pesticide free because it's for our own health and it's for our own nutrition. We don't want pesticides in our nutrition. It's obvious. So you see two different ways of looking at beekeeping. Apitherapy, that is way more deep, and also that other one, which is pollination, huge companies with so many bees, because if you do pollination, very often you'll have lots of bees. You'll have hundreds of hives, thousands of hives. In Alberta, northern Alberta, where there's canola production in Canada, some beekeepers have actually thousands of hives, of beehives. It's huge numbers, and I'm sure in the States also they have that type of numbers. So it's humongous, it's big production. Of course, the ethical care of bees when you do this is not there. Honestly, to be honest, it's not there. Of course, they won't take really great care of their bees. Of course, it's obvious. You cannot question that. It's so obvious. So two different ways of looking at it. Now, if you think a bit more deeply about this, you'll find out that it's the same thing for ourselves, humans, for people. Are we programmed to, fill our function in the world, do that job, participate in the system somehow, and, fill the part that we think, oh, I have to do this for my country, for my family, for this or that? Are we feeling that pollination need and that fear that if I don't do my part, everything will fall apart? Well, that's one way of looking at it, but you could also look at it the other way, the apitherapy point of view, where what do I do as a person? Do I feel that, that special thing that I could be doing, that emotional connection, that great genius idea that I can bring to society? What do I share with my friends? What is the type of life I'm living? And how rich is it? And can I share this with others? Would that participate maybe more to the full development of our big human being family on Earth? This is a different point of view, and it's important to see those two different aspects. We are very often programmed to think we have a function to fill and we have to do this, and it's that way of thinking which is so similar to let's send our people work in pesticides, do awful jobs, terrible things, pollute the planet, do all crazy things because we think economically that's what works. That's what is important. I have to do that job. I know it's not good, for environment or whatever else, or just human health in general, like mental health too. It's I know it's not good for me. I know I'll probably die younger because of that, but economically it's good. I have to do it. Of course, I'm not that happy, but it's the role I have to fill, like this pollination role. Like it's just the same idea, but that apitherapy point of view would be, as a human being, I'm creating much more than just that role. I'm having an emotional impact on my surrounding, intellectual impact on my surrounding, and my actions too are changing people around me. By my action, by what I'm actually doing, I'm changing, I'm building society around me just because of what I'm doing. So we see those properties of honey, pollen, propolis. They have great properties and we can use them in a really great way, and it fills so many needs, so many more than just that pollination thing and some honey production that is so often cut with sugar. Terrible thing. So it's a different point of view, and it's the same in our life. Do we go for feeling just that I have a job kind of thing, or am I giving who I am to the world, to society, my true self, like my real values, the real value of who I am? It's all about giving value to who we are and seeing ourselves as just a pawn in the whole game, or someone special that gives and share what is precious. And this is so important, to switch from one point of view to the other. For the bees, it's key to switch from that pollination slash honey and sugar honey production to apitherapy. It's really important, and the same thing happens in our own life. So I just wanted to bring this deeper level of understanding of that switch I'm talking about bees, but also showing that it also works for ourselves as people, as human beings, because to work in apitherapy, it's so difficult to change that way of thinking about beekeeping and the value of the bee products, showing the real value of those bee products when you do real beekeeping, not just exploiting the bees. Well, it's so difficult. It's important to connect it with deeper values, and that's why I always do this in my videos. So that's the little sharing today, that is supposed to bring inspiration to all of us and make us think a bit deeper. So thank you very much for listening to this apitherapy video, and see you another time for another video, of course.